Since time immemorial, Native people have lived, traveled, and traded in the Puget Sound region. The Donation Land Act of 1850, to encourage western expansion, allowed American settlers to claim these traditional native lands. The explosion of immigration into the region that followed forced the United States government into a fraught treaty-making process with local tribes. The original terms of Medicine Creek Treaty were inadequate and ultimately unacceptable by tribal leaders, resulting in war. The award-winning Indigenous Voices Podcast is an extension of the Puget Sound Treaty War Panel Series and of Fort Nisqually Living History Museum. The podcast advances tribal voices in the telling of Puget Sound history and shares tribal knowledge and expertise for wider audiences.
Fort Nisqually Living History Museum acknowledges that we operate on the traditional homelands of the Puyallup and Nisqually tribes, and on lands with deep significance to other Coast Salish tribes. Coast Salish people have lived on and stewarded these lands since time immemorial and continue to do so today. We recognize that this land acknowledgement is one small step toward true allyship, and we commit to uplifting the voices, experiences, and histories of the Indigenous people of this land and beyond.
Hello, my name is Warren KingGeorge. I'm an enrolled member of the Muckleshoot Indian tribe on my father's side, and on my mother's side, I descend from the Upper Skagit tribe.
Nettsie Bullchild, Nisqually Indian tribe, Director of Archives and Tribal Historic Preservation Office, tribal member, and tribal elder.
Haslachel, Togalapo, Deisha, Desiyaya Chulup, Brandon Reynon Titsta, Puyallup Chud, Duflalut Debati, Director/THPO. My name is Brandon Reynon. Welcome. I am the Director and THPO for the Puyallup Tribe of Indians. I'm also a Puyallup tribal member.
Haslachel, Takablu Sitsta, Puyallup Chud. Good day, my name is Takablu. I'm from the Puyallup tribe. My English name is Amber Taylor. I am the daughter of Eric Bennett and Carol Taylor, the granddaughter of Ramona Bennett, Clyde Bill, Patricia Taylor, and Al Taylor.
Welcome to Season 3 of the Indigenous Voices Podcast. As we wrapped up Season 2, participants discussed the importance of Native teachings, the benefits of tribal sovereignty for all of us, and the hopes of the Treaty War warriors. The first episode of Season 3 explores tribal sovereignty. Our panelists discuss tribal governance, tribal versus American citizenship, laws and taxes, and discourse around Native sovereignty and how these conversations have changed over time.
That term sovereignty has been utilized extensively, and I hope that a lot of listeners will actually take the time to look it up. There's been some confusion over how this term applies to native sovereign nations. It'd be worthwhile for listeners to Google it real quick, or look it up in your dictionary next to your other books. That's a term that I believe that is complicated and also very reassuring to those who understand it and its implications. Sovereignty is there was a price to pay for a lot of today's tribes to be able to use that term sovereignty. It wasn't cheap and it wasn't free. Blood, sweat, and tears literally was the price to pay to get people to acknowledge the fact that tribes, federally recognized tribes, retained the rights to exercise hunting and gathering and fishing, etc. It's a term that bears a lot of weight, and depending on the context, when sovereignty is utilized in Indian country, it is a word of authority. It is a term of also endearment, to honor our ancestors, to honor their belief, and to honor their campaign that our culture and our existence continue in the manner and in the ways that they set forth. It's a very powerful term, sovereignty, and I'm really proud to say that a lot of the tribes here in the Pacific Northwest have utilized this term and have exercised their rights based on the term to address concerns, to address treaty rights issues, to address their government to government issues, whether it be with the city or the county or state or even the federal. That term allows or signifies that tribes have the ability and possess the ability to sit at tables and discuss what happens to the natural resources that help define who they are and where they come from.
I like to say unalienable sovereignty. There's something that we've always had and can never be taken away from us as a tribe. The government, even if they decided to one day say, hey, you know what, we don't recognize you anymore, it doesn't matter. We still function as a government. That's kind of happened from the get-go anyway. But sovereignty is something that it is our right, again, our unalienable right as a tribal nation. As for Puyallup, I'm speaking for Puyallup only here. It is because each nation, each tribal nation, each people are different, and so at Puyallup, we choose to exercise our unalienable sovereignty by setting our own laws, setting our own constitution. We have our own court system. We have our own law enforcement. We have our own government. We have we have everything that is set up, and it's what we choose it to be. It's how we've chosen to rule ourselves as our own nation. And all the members who are enrolled in the Puyallup tribe get to enjoy the benefits of that sovereignty. You get the benefits that come with being able to exercise that right to call yourself your own nation. It's interesting because we are dual citizens as tribal members. All of us are tribal members, so we're dual citizens within our own. So we're a country within a country. So when I'm on the Puyallup reservation, I'm a Puyallup citizen. I'm a Puyallup Nation citizen. And then when I go home, I live off reservation because can't afford to live on the reservation. And so, I become a citizen of the United States first. And so it's kind of interesting, that we get that as tribal members. We get to claim and exercise our unalienable sovereignty rights here on the reservation.
So tribal sovereignty here at Puyallup, in terms of how the tribe is governed, we have the right to govern ourselves. We create our own laws, our own codes, our own legal system, as Brandon had mentioned. We also elect our own leadership, and that leadership is comprised of 7 individuals here at Puyallup. We have a council of 7 in our governing body, and we elect those individuals. Not much different than other folks elect, people that are going into Senate, Congress to be their mayor. We elect them to make decisions based on the well-being of the community itself and to advocate on behalf of the tribal citizens. It's the right to govern ourselves and to do so within the best interest of the citizens of Puyallup Nation.
Yeah, and along those lines, so we also, with those elections, we elect the governing council, and that council appoints a chairman and a vice chairman or chairwoman in our instance currently. But yeah, that's important because that also puts them at the same level. And so when it comes to government relations, whether it's government with tribal government with the United States government or the Puyallup tribe government with the Washington state government, the chairman or vice chairwoman, they are on the same level at the federal level. They are the president. Their counterpart is the president of the United States. On the state level, it's the governor of the state. The county, it's the county, whatever, manager, commissioner, whatever it is. And so the governing body, they are equal to the executive branch of government. we have, as part of a sovereignty, we summarize that we have our own judicial, we have our own executive, and our own legislative branch, just like the U.S. government, just like a state government.
And looking it up, part of it said it was in an inherited, not granted, right. And it was here the tribes practiced it, I guess you would say, lack of a better word, long before the United States was ever found, created. So with that said, that's a part of it that I feel is very important to our next generations, that they need to understand that it's an inherent right, not something that was granted to them. It gives us the right to negotiate. Before, like when we talked treaty, there wasn't no negotiations. They wrote that treaty and had it ready for us to put the X's alongside it, even though we didn't understand it. So now with that sovereignty comes this right to negotiate anything that, needs to happen with our tribes, provided by our own government, which to me is very important because I just had to go through one and it was very taxing because you feel the effects of the site that you're trying to protect. And that is the other part of the sovereignty. It helps to protect, but you see what you're trying to protect, but yet you're negotiating to like, okay, we'll let you have that if you guys give us this. And it's not the same, it's never going to be the same, a site that's being developed or destroyed, for whatever reason, it's very hard to sit in on negotiations that you're like, our job as tribal people is to protect, we're trying to protect these sites, but it's hard also to explain to these people what these sites mean to us. A lot of us have these memories, with our families of where we went fishing, where we went gathering, for mine, it was always going to pick huckleberries, clam digging. So people don't understand that's something that we're trying to protect, to give to our next generation, even though there's no physical building, there's no physical anything there. It's just that right to be able to go up and pick those huckleberries or go and gather plants, go clam digging, for our people. So that's why that protection helps protect our identity, so it still carries on down the line. So for me, sovereignty is that. It's just that right to say that. It's open to interpretation, so people kind of use it for, what they want to use it for, but sometimes it becomes, well, you're sovereign, and so what do you guys have to worry about? And it's like, yeah, but you have to look at what we gave up, what happened to get that, so sometimes it becomes this word, but in looking it up, some of these really affect you on how it affects the tribe, especially for government to government, so it's really an important word that we should always use and that we should always pass down.
Before cell phones, before we all had a phone in our pocket, before we all had a video camera in our pocket, things were very different. And when I was growing up, there was a lot of gang violence in East Tacoma, and we lived here. And so we came across it. Some of us may have been involved in that crisis and what was happening here in our community at that time. And there was always this belief that when we were on reservation, tribal police, like anytime we got in trouble with City of Tacoma, or there was a lot of profiling actually that happened back in that era as well, where my grandpa calls it, he calls it DWI, driving while Indian, right? So the city of Fife was specifically a tough one back in that era, which I don't see as much anymore. Some of that policing has kind of loosened up a little bit. But if you were caught, DWI, driving while Indian, you would be pulled over for any number of reasons, just because they were profiling or because you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so back in that era, when you could essentially show Tacoma police, Fife police, your tribal ID, and what they should have done would have been to notify tribal police that they had apprehended, tribal citizens, but it all depended on who you got, right? So a lot of times that would make law enforcement that was not tribal police angry, upset. They'd be mad. They'd drag you out of the car. They'd handcuff you. So there was a lot of things that happened back when I was a youth. And so in that time, we had a perception of kind of not necessarily what we could get away with, but if I got pulled over going, 3 to 5 miles per hour over the speed limit by Tacoma police, they have no jurisdiction over me, right? Now, and this, like, I clearly remember we had just left the river. It was like 4th of July. We were down under 11th Street Bridge on the Puyallup River, which were on our land. We were lighting fireworks, having a good time, and we had just left, and we were on Portland Ave, almost to where Puyallup Avenue is, and my brother was driving, and we were giving a couple friends ride home, and we got pulled over, and it was Tacoma police, and he says, I'm a tribal citizen. Can you call tribal? And we're not calling effing tribal. And they drug us all out of the car, and he ended up going to jail. And, but the recourse for that is like, at that time, as a young person, he was probably 18, 19. It felt so heavy to challenge the system of you unlawfully detained me on reservation land when I made it known. Prove it, right? So it was not a very comfortable time. Now I would just accept a ticket and be on my way. I wouldn't say call tribal, but because I'm not trying to make anybody mad, and just give it to the lawyers, hand it to the lawyers, and they'll take care of it. But we didn't necessarily have all of that the way we do now. But yes, there is a real feeling of knowing when. And then knowing when somebody's not upholding, the law, right? As a tribal citizen, if I'm in distress, or if I'm on tribal land and my car is broken into, or if somebody is profiling because you're driving while Indian, whatever the case, we have access to different technology now to where it protects us in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think also when I get on the res, there is, because I have the fortunate enough to work in where we work in the Historic Preservation Department, there is a aspect of pride, an extra level of pride, because as this podcast is focused on, we in the very first episodes, we talk about what it took to get this reservation, what it took to be here today. And so when you arrive on and back in every day to the reservation, you have a sense of pride about, I am the descendant. Amber's pointed out to our staff many times that we are the seventh generation that our ancestors dreamed about. And so, when I come home to the reservation, it is very much like, all right, I'm on the land that my ancestors fought for. This is what they fought for. And so there is a sense of pride when you come back on and you get to put back on your Puyallup citizenship. We obviously carry with us no matter where we're at. But when you get on that reservation, when you get back on Puyallup reservation, that sense of pride does get a boost because we know why we're here and who got us here.
Just the word citizenship, it does create a different thing, because we, like I always tell people, we didn't create that. We don't own that word. So, we were a people. We were tribal people, we were, there was everybody, like we have that term, all my relations, we knew where that came from. And that's kind of how we grew up. Like I said, my mom would always, oh yeah, come over, they're our relations. I'm like, how? I don't know, they're just our relations. Just, she would know that. But, that's a part of it. You never felt that difference unless you went off reservation, unless, like, when we went to school, I think there was like 8 Indians in this whole school that, you felt it. And I had said that in some other presentation I was doing. I said it came to a point where I feel, for me, I became insensitive to that because we have dealt with it so long. We have dealt with the prejudice, the racism, that it just kind of washes off your back now. It's like, whatever, we've heard it. We don't, we're going the route we should be going for, our next generation, and hoping that they do better than we did. My son didn't experience it, because he had these different nationality friends, so when he was with them and their family, he became one of them, so he never knew there was that until he got out of school. And then he came home and said that, he says, people are really racist. I was like, it's always been there, but he never noticed it. So there is that definite difference, in how you're treated with that word, with the citizenship. So, and like Amber said, the profiling, that's what the younger generation remembers. My son remembers, oh, they're just profiling us. I was like, so that's not a good thing that you think about, that as you're driving down the road, or if you're someplace, it's like, oh, they're probably profiling us, But for years, we've talked about that. Like, I have never seen a blue card, but I've heard about them. An identification for you that you were Indian. The Bureau sent them out. You'd have that for whatever you needed. But yeah, a lot of the reses had them, not just here locally, but all over, And I was like, what do you mean you had a blue card? I don't even know what that was. So yeah, but that's how it's been through ages. We were ID'd, and we still, like that, to prove things, you still have to pull out your tribal ID. Tribal has always been marked. You went from a blue card, and now, like you say, we have tribal ID. We have to show our tribal ID, just to say, I'm Nisqually, unless you have these cards, which started way back to where, because I would tell people, what's a blue card? I don't even know what you're talking about. So it's been there since the beginning, when, with like I said, with the treaty. In the day, and I'll say it before casinos, you would know how to follow somebody that you knew was Indian, because we all called it, there goes an Indian car. You guys know what I mean? So even on the canoe journey, we went on the canoe journey, I'm trying to get directions in Canada, and they're like, oh, do this, do that, and then, we go to another person, and they say, oh, go down here to the gas station, take a right, and then go to the store and take a left, I mean, we get down there and we're like, oh, there goes an Indian car. We're going to follow that one, and we found our way. Today, because, like I have worked since I can, was out of school, but, kids are grown, so I can afford, a nice car. But nowadays, like I said, back in the day, it was always follow that car. That's an Indian car. They're going wherever we're going. But, that became a part of identity because you couldn't afford it. My dad fished, and we had to use our family car to haul all these fish in the trunk, and it was like, you didn't want him taking us anywhere because the whole car smelled like fish when you went someplace. So I always feel there's a difference with, on Nisqually, on the reservation, it's Peter Kalama Drive, which is the main part of the reservation. But you have a lot of non-Indians that come on to the res, and they just go flying up our street. You're looking at them like, who is that? We don't even know who they are. A lot of times it's in the summer because they're going to swim, but, they just feel they have this right to bomb on through your, road and everything, and then you call the cops and they have to go chase them down and stop them. And they're like wondering, well, why do we have to do this? And it's like, we have laws too. We have kids on this block, we have cars that would just park on our street, and we'd call the cops, and it's like, can you come see what they're doing? And they go, well, what are they doing? And I said, they're parked there, and we have kids on this street. We don't know who they are, so it's always this difference of, oh, if you do it off res, we would get stopped, but these other people can come on our res and do things, and then when they question, what right have you? I'm just parked here. It's like, you're in front of my house, don't be parking in front of my house because I don't even know who you are. So there is, to me, that difference, just even, and we're just, like I said, we're pretty central here at Nisqually. So you find that, and then you find them, because we have the correction facility up the street, you run into the same thing. They send them to the bus stop, and a lot of them just hike up to the casino, and, you're like, okay, where did these guys come from? So, it's always this block watch that we have to do, on the res for our kids, because, they like to go to the stores and just walk around and, do that kind of stuff. So there's a difference.
I just find that there's still places that are not willing to accept tribal ID as an actual form of identification. I mean, that's so infuriating. But when they started pushing this real ID, and everybody had to have real ID, it seems like as Native people, we have to educate everywhere we go. So even when you're standing standing in the airport about to take a flight, although they should all be trained on what they can and can't accept as ID. You're having to educate them that tribal ID is acceptable ID, and it's even all the way down to being in a restaurant and like somebody in the party ordering an alcoholic beverage and giving a tribal ID and them saying, nope, I'm not going to accept that. And having to educate the wait people and pull it up on the, state of Washington website. I mean, that's been a problem as long as I can remember, is folks just not wanting to accept tribal ID because it's not real, although I consider it just as good as any military or federal ID.
And at one time, like I said, my husband's Blackfeet. His dad traveled, he lived in Yakima, but they would always go back to Browning, Montana. But he could cross Canada back and forth. We'd be like, where are we going? And they're going, oh, we're going to go sit here because then we got to cross the border. We're going over there for a ceremony. There wasn't no ID required. You just sat there and you wait and you crossed the border because you were, tribal. Now, it's back to the same thing. It's like, what happened to that? They question you for every little thing, and your ID should be good, to let you cross over. And, they want to know what you're doing. Like my niece got stopped because she had an eagle feather, hanging on her mirror. And they were like, what are you doing with it? You can't bring that in. And she says, I'm, Native American and we're allowed. And, they questioned her on that kind of stuff. So you feel it, even now, like I said, back then, he never had to show any ID. We just crossed over and went across the border.
I think I will kind of talk about state recognition of tribal sovereignty, specifically with obviously Puyallup, but also the local tribes here. And there was not always such a great relationship. I wouldn't say that our relationship's actually great, but a lot more consultation happening. So with 29 tribes within the state of Washington, I think that the state really doesn't have much of a choice other than to begin to recognize sovereignty. And that came from so many fights and so many battles. And the discussion I was having earlier relating to no cell phones, no cameras, not even money to buy a VHS recorder back in the 70s, back in the 60s, when they reel to reel, whatever was used back in that time, not even the money to be able to buy a camera to be able to show proof of what was happening to people, and having to bring in allies that were willing to help and record. And, as long as the river runs, the documentary that was created, Carol Burns bringing in people that were willing to stand down there on the front lines and really put themselves at risk right alongside us to document what was happening in those eras and that time, and all of the things that went undocumented. It took a really long time, and it really did take court hearing after court hearing after court hearing. My question really is, has the United States ever really respected tribal sovereignty? I mean, that's really the question. They have not. I mean, definitely not. But when the United States stepped in US v. Washington on the tribe's behalf, which led down to the Bolt decision. So that was a pretty big turning point. But I think that we are finally coming to a point where within the state of Washington, these different compacts and these different things that have happened, and different representation, who is essentially governing the state of Washington, becoming more of an ally than they were in the past. I think that there's been a lot of changes that have happened over time in relation to that.
Well, I think you look at the sovereignty recognition has been up and down depending on the time frame. So it was, of course, the British that came here first, and they recognized our use of the land, and they recognized they needed us to survive, and so the relationship was relatively okay with Hudson Bay Company. There was lots of intermarrying going on. It wasn't until the United States arrived in the 1850s that the issue really went downhill real fast. Their mentality of manifest destiny and, God put us here, and, therefore you guys you beasts and you wild things need to get out of here, and so we need this land because God wants us to have it. So the recognizing the sovereignty went completely opposite. And complete disregard for our sovereignty. Then in the 1830s, well, wait a minute, we should probably allow them to organize themselves. We won't let them vote yet, but we'll at least let them recognize themselves, right? And then we can't even vote until 1870s. I think it was 1870s we got to vote. So we couldn't even vote in within our own area. And then of course for Puyallup in the 1980s, the city of Tacoma is refusing to recognize their sovereignty, but the U.S. government says, well, yes, they are here. And so you had the state and the state and the city at odds with the federal government. The federal government stood up for us in the Bull decision and in the 88 settlement. Like they are a sovereign nation. You have to recognize them. And it's like, wow, so we've been on both ends of that as well. And then, now we're a political power. I think every one of us can say that. Muckleshoot, Nisqually, and Puyallup are all political powers in each of our counties that we reside in. As Amber alluded to, the change in leadership at each of those levels, as they become more and more educated, as we have been out educating folks about who we are and about our sovereignty, and have been helping them understand and educating out the ignorance of those leaders. Now we have we're at a point where we have a say in local laws that are being developed around us. And so we're able to have a little bit of political weight. I always say we spent the last 200 years learning how to play the game, and now we've learned it, and now we're playing it better. Like now we're doing it better than you. It's one of those things where we've learned how to do this game of political power, and now we are starting to wield a little bit of our weight for once. And it's been good in a lot of ways. We have a lot of different things, exercising our sovereign right to fish, our sovereign right to hunt. Our hunting grounds are constantly being shrunk, but we're fighting back finally. Our fish populations are dying, but it's finally listening to the tribes that our populations are starting to begin to recover. It's been an up and down relationship, sovereignty-wise, and getting that sovereignty recognized. But over the past 200 years, we are now in a spot where we can fight and have a say. We're included at every level of government, at the county, the city, local, and even up to the governor's office in the cabinet as a Puyallup tribal member. And so tribes are now forcing our sovereignty to be recognized.
Yeah, I would absolutely say that protecting tribal children is a part of sovereignty, which the Indian Child Welfare Act is enacted to protect tribal children from being removed from tribal families, right? From being removed from the reservation or the community at whole without good cause, right? So there are instances where Native children are placed in foster or even adoptive homes, but the Indian Child Welfare Act is in place to protect tribal children because there were so many that were being taken. It became an epidemic after the boarding school. What came next, right? And that was Christian families really wanting to save the Indian, and they continued save the Indian and adopting out children. And there was a lot of really awful things that were done when children were taken. They weren't necessarily even living in a bad situation. It was not understanding the culture and not understanding what the home life is like for that individual child or even that community, and not deeming it as appropriate, right? So you have children's services coming in, CPS coming in and taking children away because, they had too many people living in a household, or maybe their idea of what a family should be eating wasn't the same as what this family was eating because they, were eating traditional food or whatever the case may be, all the way down to accusations of alcoholism and drug abuse, and the babies that are born with what is it called, the Mongolian mark on the back, on the lower back. That's happened in a lot of communities where the marking on the back, and it's the same with a lot of Native children, and they would accuse them of having beat or bruised a newborn infant. And those children were taken away because there was signs of bruising. And so how is a medical professional not understanding that type of thing? So a lot of I would say there's a lot of laws and protections that have put in place across the nation for Native people, and the root is sovereignty. I mean, I don't know, when we talk, I was texting with Brandon this morning talking about sovereignty. Like as Native people, we know what sovereignty means. We know there's like it can be a hard thing to describe though, because it's so intertwined. It's like, how do you explain it to somebody that doesn't understand? Well, I feel like if somebody wants to understand, they will. That makes sense. I don't really know how else to, there's a lot of deep meaning around it, but putting that to words in a way that a person that has never really experienced can be challenging.
Our elders and ancestors, they weren't allowed to tell these things. They weren't allowed to speak up, and that's where, just like that, the boarding school came into effect, because you weren't allowed to keep your kids. You were threatened with going to jail, and so what do you do? And, you hide them, they run away. I mean, there's just a lot of terrible stories about that, but it was, like I say, my mom said she asked her mom why she wouldn't teach her language and her, these traditions. And she told her, she says, because I don't want you getting in trouble. She said, that's what would happen to us. So there was a lot of this silence that happened with, like I said, our elders and our ancestors. And right now, the newer generations are speaking up. They're finding their voice. And that's where I feel a lot of these generations have to get involved. I tell people it's our responsibility as a tribe to speak up. Not that I want to be in every podcast, which I probably will, but, you have to get involved. It's really hard because, you're dealing with a lot of things besides your personal life. But if nobody speaks up, here we are again with all these things that people don't understand, they don't know. And we go to different events, put up a table and they're like, oh, what is this? And like nowadays, I am grateful that there are a lot of tribal people writing books. Ramona Bennett, I am so glad that that's happening, because these truths are coming out. What was, people would tell these stories, all over, oh, they did this, they did that. Now you're getting all of it. And that was the same with Cecilia. She said, I wanted to tell the tribal history from our side, not have them look at something else. So that's helped a great deal with these people correcting this history that somebody else thought they knew, and like I said, speaking up, having that voice instead of saying, no, I don't want to talk about that, and I didn't like that era, or, I don't know what they're talking about. So, like I go on and tell people that I don't have an Indian name. I have a nickname, don't have an Indian name, don't do the language, but, my nieces who were, like I said, they've been on canoe journey. I haven't been on the canoe, but there's just things like that they just are grasping. They're so comfortable with doing this that it shows it's working. Like I tell my son, just come with me. You don't have to speak up, but just I want you to see what's going on. You're always invited. He goes to repatriation. We went to the last one at Puyallup. And he's just, he loves going to that just to see the ceremony, just to see the people, because he's always wished he could hear his grandpa speaking. He said, I wish I could hear what he had to say, because he fought for Nisqually. But there's things like that they're really holding on to now and really wanting to make that difference. So I think a lot of this is working, but it is, in my age, a little bit younger than me, we really have to get involved, and teaching at schools, teaching at colleges. Like we said in the canoe journey, they're taking the canoe into the schools just to show them what canoe journey is all about. So it's really good that they're being comfortable doing this kind of thing. I'm really proud of them.
We're talking about citizenship, 1924 is really interesting when you think about the different perspectives. A lot of these, in the oral history that we have, and the recordings that we have, and the documentation we have in our archives, you kind of see two different kind of thinkings. A lot of the older ones who were, either from the treaty era or their parents were treaty signers, or their parents were veterans of the treaty war. They looked at the 1924 as, when they're recognized as, American citizens, citizens of the United States. It was kind of like well, don't care. It was like an overall like, well, so what? I'm a Puyallup, or I'm a native person. And then there are the other ones who were like, yeah, this is great. Now we can do things, even though it didn't end up being the case. Like I said, the voting didn't even come a thing until another couple decades later. But did it affect their sovereignty? Absolutely not. Like, they were a sovereign nation still. And I still ask this question to myself all the time: what was the big deal? That's when I would go back and look, and you would see like Wapato John, or who was my family member. It was like it was a so what? No, it was nothing. He didn't care. It was, we're Puyallups. We don't have to be citizens of the United States, because we're a sovereign nation. We're a sovereign people to begin with. So I thought it was interesting that you had two different kind of thoughts of not a big deal, and other tribal members thought it was a big deal.
Here at Puyallup, there was something, and I can't quite remember the year, but there was something that predated essentially that declaration of Indian citizenship across the nation, and it had to do with the land patent. It had to do with the allotment and the land patent in the Puyallup Land Act, I believe, through my research, that you were deemed a citizen through that land patent. And so I don't know what happened from there, and I can't speak for all tribal nations across the United States or the Turtle Island. I can't speak for everybody, but this may have had more impact in other areas of the country than it did here. One of the things that I find really interesting in looking at the date, right, 1924, what came after, what came immediately after, right? So when you're talking about the Citizenship Act, it was just based on research. It was essentially a reward for fighting in World War I. So predating that, you could fight for this nation, but you were not a member of this nation. So I think that's really an interesting thing to kind of go down that rabbit hole. The country didn't fully recognize Native people, but they allowed them to fight in the war. But here locally, we had the 1929, the rolls that came, a few years after that. So they had the Citizenship Act, and then next thing you know, we have folks coming through creating the first tribal rolls in 1929, which is a whole nother thing. But essentially creating a committee of members here at Puyallup that deemed who were and who were not Puyallup people. So
yeah, we were exercising our sovereignty. Like we're going to determine who are Puyallups and who's not. Because of that, we got to that first or one of our instances where we got to practice our sovereignty and have that self-determination
through the enrollment committee.
Mm-hmm.
The question was about the American citizenship to Native people in 1924, and how it affected the tribal sovereignty. The response to that is depending on your background, on your knowledge. From my perspective, my late mother's father, his name was George Williams. He was a veteran of World War I. He was a Upper Skagit tribal member. He was a teenager when he went to the Navy, and served this country. I don't know how that affected his benefits, if he received any. I'm sure he did, but I don't know how that affected his status. My memory of my grandpa George is as a young boy was, I was just a little taller then. I was very young. I was probably 5 or 6 years old when I remember visiting him. But I think that would be complicated because of that dual citizenship, dual membership, or dual identity, right? because you have a social security card by that time. You have an employer, and you're probably very familiar with your traditional language, and you're also familiar with Lushootsi or English. That dual citizenship can be tricky, and I think what I like to call the beginning of institutionalization. A lot of our tribal members really had a difficult time traveling beyond the reservation boundaries. I grew up in a time when there was a sign actually on the highway out here, 164, and as you're traveling east on 164 going up from the city of Auburn, there was a big sign that says "Entering the Muckleshoot Reservation." There was also a sign on the way down when you're entering Auburn, leaving the Muckleshoot Indian Reservation. And I often wondered why would you need to identify that? Why was that? As a boy traveling, reading that sign, and then I kind of pieced it together. A lot of our tribal members here feel a lot more comfortable when they're standing in their own village, when they're standing within the boundaries of the reservation, which I think, from my personal opinion, reservation just a horrible word. I prefer village in this day and age. I'm more comfortable saying the Muckleshoot village. I think that's a better description, and reservation has negative feelings about it. And for most of my elders, most of my teachers, a lot of them are gone now. They've got really good stories. Some of them are real funny stories about actually learning to know the law enforcement on a first name basis because of their learning about what they can and cannot do. Learning the limitations of living on the reservation, and at the same time learning about some of the laws. They learned those laws not by books or going to school. They learned it by actually full immersion. they, by getting pulled over, getting put in jail, etc. And then there's also that chapter in our life where when we learned about Washington State and their position on laws. At the time, the Washington State Attorney Slade Gordon, it was his opinion that the states had authority over federally recognized tribes, and it was the state's position to govern how much and where tribes can fish and how much and the location. Well, that's what the treaty, the fish wars were all about. Slade Gordon lost that battle. That was one of his big defeats in his career as a Washington State Attorney General. Very powerful position, right? Elected official. He took that as far as he possibly could go, and actually, the Supreme Court ruled against him again, not once but twice. And here's another branch of the Washington State Authority. It's the WDFW, Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife. A lot of our tribal members, a lot of our elders, they had their run-ins with law enforcement. Those were the people that were sent out to enforce state law on tribal people. Most of it fishing and hunting. A lot of tickets were written. A lot of fines were applied. That's an interesting chapter in tribal history. And then next you got the Washington State Department of Natural Resources, DNR. Those were the gatekeepers to our natural resources, to our traditional and cultural resources. We had to fight tooth and nail. We oftentimes had to go to court. We were the ones who had to prove that we have traditional use of these berries or traditional use of these trees. And that burden of proof was always on the tribes. And unfortunately, that's how it was in those days. But thanks to tenacious leaders, thanks to warriors and administrative warriors, legal warriors, we won most of those cases. And it's because of them we've got this continued cultural use of berries and cedar bark and traditional plant use, traditional foods. That chapter of learning about responsibilities, learning about federal and trust responsibilities, that was a real dark chapter. And it's been a long time since anybody challenged those, right? That because precedence has been set, and I think it'll be a long time before it's ever challenged again. But I think that's my take on this, on living in two worlds, living as a Washington State U.S. citizen and as a tribal citizen. It's got benefits, but it also has its downfalls as well. You've heard testimony from these other podcast members. It's not easy being native outside the boundaries of your reservation or boundaries of your village. It really is a hardship, because that, like I said, that burden of proof is always something that thrown at us on a daily basis. Even our own council members, when they go exercise their treaty right, they've got to provide their permit or provide their tribal ID, just like the rest of us. It's a really challenging time, especially when our resources are shrinking, when our resources are undermanaged, and there's not as much resources to go around as there once was when we were younger. Those natural resources have been mismanaged and undermanaged for so long that a lot of it is hard to get to and hard to actually accumulate or get access to. So really is a challenging time, but I have faith in our leaders today, and I have faith in positions that people hold. We've got all the pieces to the puzzle, and as long as we work together as Native people, as sovereign Native people, we'll overcome all of these challenges that are coming our direction. I believe that with all of my heart.
So, what determines, non-native governance on tribal members is the sovereignty in general, right? We're a sovereign nation. We're a sovereign people. And so therefore, in that sovereignty, and unalienable sovereignty is, if I'm on the Puyallup reservation, I am not subject as a sovereign individual belonging to a sovereign nation. I'm not subject to that state law. That only pertains to state and county laws, that sort of thing. But state laws in general, but federal laws, we're still subject as tribal members to federal laws. So sovereignty is something that we get to as tribal members, and we have that right to only be subject to the laws of the land, which is by the U.S. Constitution. The treaty for each of us becomes the law of the land, right? So the treaties are the law of the land. So the treaty itself gives us that right to not be subject to non-native state laws.
Because, we do get into that on reservation versus off reservation. Because, like when you do a building, like a facility off reservation, I believe you have to abide by their codes, the state. But then if you're on reservation, it's not that we don't look at safety, but, it's just different.
I see on the flip side, too, when we did the WashDOT project here, when I-5 expanded a couple of years ago, we actually had stricter rainwater discharge laws, right? And so because we were a federal sovereign nation, WashDOT had to actually enhance their runoff off of the new freeway. So it was kind of the flip side. Whereas Washington and the Washington state laws only required a certain level of filtering of rainwater off of the freeway. They had to enhance there because the Puyallup tribal law, being the supreme law of the land, that's what I was looking for, supreme law of the land, had to be adhered to. And so Washington had to up their stuff. So it goes both ways.
I think another example of what determines what non-native governance extends to tribal members I think a classic example of that is the culvert case, when agencies, timber companies, U.S. Forest Service, state lands, the DNR, these little tributaries that feed the river systems and lake systems here in the Pacific Northwest. These culverts were substandard or even blocking, in some cases, completely blocking access for salmon. And so this indirectly triggers an obligation to treaty rights. Fish passage is what this case is all about. And fish passage, fish are vital to tribal villages. It's important that listeners understand that there's value. There's more than just monetary value to salmon. There's a cultural and traditional value that's priceless. And so, in order for this to continue, or in order for this to be paid forward to our future children and grandchildren and great grandchildren, these culverts had to be replaced and repaired, and to allow thousands of miles of fish habitat to be accessible by the salmon runs and trout runs. So I think this is a great example that shows that undeniable relationship between the tribes and the natural resources. And so this was more than just a acknowledgement of professional courtesy. It wasn't done out of the kindness of their heart. It was done because the Supreme Court said they had to in 2018. So by 2030, all of these culverts have to be up to standard, fish passable standards.
Here I look at kind of the flip side, and that's a great example, Warren. I look at the flip side of non-tribal members on tribal land, right? What is the jurisdictional issues that we face being all three of our tribes are very close to large metro areas, and how does that play a role, right? So you have a lot of non-native citizens, and so I think a lot of reservations across the nation that have a large land base, but maybe don't have as much city within their limits or nearby their limits, to where kind of folks outside of the tribe aren't necessarily having, well, that's not even true, because you've got all these incidents across the nation of natural resources, whatever natural resource on a particular reservation, and you've got people that come with the stripping of those natural resources and the jurisdictional issues that arise when we have, missing and murdered, and we have crime happening against Native people on the reservation, and there is no jurisdiction over non-Native citizens necessarily by tribal jurisdiction, right? So it becomes a federal issue, and whether or not a federal judge wants to prosecute on that particular issue. So it kind of on the flip side of that, when you're within the city, like here, we're in the city of Tacoma, and we have a lot of different groups of people from all over that live here, not just Puyallup tribal members, and how does that apply on reservation? So that's kind of a different take on governance and how that is with non-Native citizens on the reservation. Like our tribal police have compacts with other, like City of Tacoma, City of Fife, City of Milton, probably City of Puyallup, all of the different jurisdictions that are here, and they work together to an extent. But that's taken a lot of years. And it's probably the same, right? City of Auburn, King County, Pierce County. It's probably the same, all of Thurston County, City of Yelm, Olympia, it's a real interesting issue to go down into the jurisdictional issues that tribes face with non-Native citizens committing crimes on the reservation. Let's say you being a citizen of the city of Fife, and there was a crime that happened in your neighborhood, or even your car was stolen, that first responding officer might be a tribal police. And in fact, in the city of Fife, I've been hearing that tribal police have been more responsive than even for non-native citizens when crime is happening in public places. They have been more responsive than Fife or Pierce County has been. So it is an interesting issue.
The taxes question is something that always comes up from every non-native, even every non-native listener's podcast is going to be like, yes, I finally get an answer. And, it's really, for tribe members, taxes, we're not subject to state and local taxes. We are subject to federal income taxes. Again, it's a state and federal thing. If it's a state or local jurisdiction tax, we're not subject to it while on the reservation. Any shopping or purchasing that's done on the reservation as a Puyallup tribe member in Fife or in Tacoma, if I'm on the res, I don't have to pay the taxes. Now, that's something that a lot of business owners are fighting, which I don't understand. There's a simple form that we just have to fill out. Every tribe member is familiar with the form. We all have our tribal ID. It's more of, I don't know if they're just getting lazy on their end. I don't know, but it's real. It's really simple. I'm a tribe member, and this is my reservation, or my village is Warren. I like that. And so I'm not subject to your taxes as a city of Fife or as the city of Tacoma, and so, but yeah, that's only applies on reservation. As soon as I go off of the reservation, I'm subject to every tax out there. But we're also subject to our own taxes. And since we're, for the tribe members the tribe has taxes that they impose on us. And so we have those taxes. But again, we are subject to federal income taxes. And so since we are all employees of our native nations, we have to pay taxes. So the fact that, long misconceptions that tribe members don't pay taxes. We don't pay some taxes, but we pay pretty much every other tax out there. So,
but wasn't that, it's been a while, but wasn't that a treaty, right? Weren't we not supposed to be taxed?
That's a good question. I'm not recalling anywhere in the Medicine Creek Treaty that talks about taxes, but maybe it's in there. I'm not.
No, I don't recall. As a matter of fact, Nettsie, you heard Brandon mention earlier that there were a lot of agencies and governments that actually took advantage of those non-paying taxes that were accumulating over time. Mm-hmm. So that's how they were able to, they being the non-natives, the local governments, the city governments and county governments were able to acquire some of these lands was back taxes that were owed. And so no, the treaties didn't exempt us from some taxes.
Because my father-in-law used to always argue that he's Blackfeet, but he says, I'm not supposed to pay taxes. So I don't know if maybe it was in their treaty, but I never looked that up to see. But yeah, there was always that argument.
Well, Washington is where, we're trying, the governor and all those, so they're trying to get a state income tax brought in, to kind of help lower prices around here. If that becomes a thing, we would not be subject to it. That's one of those taxes that we could say, hey, no, we work for the Puyallup tribe, we're a sovereign nation, we don't have to pay that state income tax.
Yeah.
But we still are a federal one. But yeah, I don't think anywhere in there it doesn't have it in there. But like Warner said, I want to say, Amber, I thought you brought up something ironically a couple weeks ago about showing us about the taxes that came up, but a law that was passed because non-natives were saying, hey, I'm on the reservation, I'm going to pay taxes. It's like, well, that's not how that works. And so Washington State did have to come up with a law that said, no, as a non-native on a reservation, you still have to pay taxes. And they did try to say, well, everybody on the reservation has to pay taxes. And it was a couple of years later that the federal government said, well, no, the tribes are not subject to state taxes. So
before this last hunting season, our tribal government sent out a notice to tribal members that if we order hunting gear or fishing gear and it's delivered to the reservation, it is considered tax exempt, but only in those categories. It can't be a part for my computer or a part for my carving shed, or it has to be for a treaty right activity.
Delivered
to the reservation, to this village, to my home, and then it is considered tax exempt. But that's the only time. Not if I go to Cabela's up in Tulalip, I'm going to pay whatever their taxes are. I'm not exempt from anything.
Because it's ironic because it was all our land. So why should we pay taxes no matter where we go? Why?
Yeah. So when we bought my wife a new car, the dealer had to deliver the car to our driveway, and then I had to take a picture of it and then send it back to the dealer, saying this car is now considered a tribal vehicle.
That's a benefit we have as Puyallup with all the dealerships on our reservation. So
yeah,
I think it's important to kind of, off of what Brandon was saying, when we're on the Puyallup reservation, we don't pay state tax, and that is state sales tax, right? Like when we're purchasing items, products, things of that nature, even like, for instance, when we go to the business Costco, that's in Fife, we don't pay sales tax on the items that we buy when we're on reservation or when it's delivered to reservation. But we pay all the same taxes everywhere else. And it's that education component again. A lot of times we have to educate those people that operate and have businesses within our community. So I have a constant fight with Boot Barn in Fife. Sorry to shout them out, but I can't tell you how many times I've walked away from the counter. And so I stopped going to that store because I leave there and I'm really upset. And I'm, I don't want to fight with people over sales tax, but sometimes it does add up. It does add up. And it, when you're talking about sovereignty, you're like, but this is my right? You're operating here in our territory, in our homeland, and you're on our reservation. And why do I have to fight you over this? It's so silly, but.
Yeah, so that's just the laziness of the Boot Barn. That's lazy employee, lazy management. Because it doesn't take. It's not their money, right? That they're refusing to. It's the state's money that they're not getting, and the state just needs to know they're not getting money. It's that simple, and why? This form says this is a Puyallup tribe member, so they don't have to pay the tax. And as a business owner, it's not a big deal. I mean, it's like one of those things. You submit it like with your report. So I don't understand why some business, and it's as tribe members, we see it on our Facebook and our socials. It's like, hey, how come they're making me pay sales tax? You don't have to, and so you're always fighting for that.
Well, it just also boils down to people's personal position or personal opinion of Native Americans. I mean, you clearly you don't have to read between the lines, Amber, with your experience with that establishment that ignorance can only excuse you so far. But after you have all the information you need to change your mind, and you still hold your position, it's no longer about education. It's about flat out ignorance.
Yeah.
Another thing was property taxes. If you don't have so if I'm a tribe member and I live on reservation, property taxes I still owe if I don't have my property in trust. And I can't put my property in trust until I completely outright own it. So there's also on res where you are subject to taxes, even if you're a tribe member. And that's one of those. That's
a great point, Brandon. We the tribe have a wonderful program because the Muckleshoot tribe has outgrown its trust space available. We now encourage our tribal membership to purchase houses outside the reservation or outside the village boundary. And so to offset that, we the tribe are currently have a program where the housing program will pay their taxes for them, their property taxes, until we can get it in trust land or trust status. that that fee land, the business can get really expensive, especially when you got a mortgage payment and a couple of car payments and everything else. Add that everything else on top of it. It difficult to make ends meet, and so thankfully this council has been real generous in that regard to help those families that are just starting out, to have their mortgage taxes covered for now.
Some will make you fill out a form, like Watson's Greenhouse. They make you fill out a form. But other places like Costco, like all you do is sign. They have it pre-filled out. Les Schwab is just to show your ID. I mean, so Sportco, show us your ID. So it's really, it just depends on the level of effort each individual business wants to do. Car dealerships is they make a photocopy, that sort of thing. So
there's other people that operate in the state of Washington that have exemption, right? Because this is already part of their system to be able that, when you're running retail, to be able to tax exempt somebody, it's already a process that they have. So there are other people that operate under the same system. So it's not really anything different than if I was a 501c3 and I was going to purchase product as a 501c3 to build, a chicken coop or whatever they're doing, they operate the same way. So the system is exactly the same. It's nothing different that a store, a retail, that they have to do. Most retailers already operate with that capability.
I'm a business owner. I own a retail company, and I encounter this every once in a while where I have, and it's kind of the same percentage. It's not like we have all 6,000 tribe members shopping, at Fife, at Costco at Fife, right? And so it is. So I don't understand the laziness, and I have no problem calling out lazy companies because it's one extra step that takes you just maybe 2 minutes to submit it. You have to submit a report each month or each quarter to your state anyway, and it's just a matter of scanning the document. And so it's just, I don't get it when you have these tribal or these businesses on the reservation that are so like, they will downright harass some of our tribal members about not having to pay taxes. And then, it's like, again, it's not your money. Like, it's not costing the business anything not to do this. I don't know. It's just crazy.
There was definitely a turnaround, not just with discussions, but with positions. The tribes were definitely getting more comfortable sitting at tables with political, I don't want to say adversaries, but political equals. And it seems like tribes were getting a little more, not attitude, but certainly were willing to stick to their guns when they knew, something was right and when something was in the best interest of the natural resource, and that which is what turns out to be a treaty right at the same time. I think that that sovereignty business, like I said earlier, it's been a term that's been misunderstood and abused and utilized out of context until recently. I definitely feel comfortable stating that our use of sovereignty, our understanding of sovereignty has certainly changed over the past decades that I've been around.
I would have to say the use of the term sovereignty has become more apparent, like even in the last decade, right? Or maybe even longer. When I was young, I don't remember people necessarily like using the term sovereignty, but we knew that there were rights and we knew that there were battles, and we knew like there was things that I was brought up learning about and hearing about, and stories and oral histories that were shared and experiences. And I don't know that the word sovereignty was necessarily utilized in the same way that it is now, if that makes any sense. It wasn't like, I feel like sovereignty is used more frequently in the education system. I feel like within our own community, more people we always just called them treaty rights or tribal rights, or So it's just kind of changed in that sense. We've always known we were a sovereign nation, but I think that the use of the word itself has kind of changed over time, in my experience anyway.
And I feel that since the tribes have been using the sovereignty word, it has, created a lot of these laws that have come into place. And like I tell people with the THPOs, the Tribal Historic Preservation Officers, this was something that was created for tribes by tribes. They saw that need of, these laws that need to take place, the NAGPRA, all of this stuff. So with that came all of these laws that helped with the protection, because that's a part of the THPOs, is to protect and preserve. Same with archives, it's to protect and preserve, it's restricted access. So there's a lot of things that happen using that the tribes, it helped tribes support all these changes that need to happen. People have to think, like we do the culture summit every year, and it's always like, okay, what's new, what's happening, what's going on. So it's working with with the THPO, it's working with all these contract consultants, that go to property owners that want to develop, or these developers that want to do all of this. And so you get a lot of those consultants that come to the tribes and say, how does this affect us? What are we supposed to do? What are we not supposed to do? So I think that's been it's helped overall, just overhaul those laws that come into place for the tribes for that protection.
It's important for the federal government. I think they have a pretty good grasp today on recognizing our sovereignty. I think for Puyallup, City of Tacoma has recognized the sovereignty much better than they did 40 years ago, 20 years ago, even 10 years ago. And so there's same with Pierce County. So for us, we're starting to see that sovereignty being recognized, and it's being seen, whether it be recognizing it through having a tribal nation flag at the city council offices or the Pierce County offices and their chambers. But I think it's important to recognize that we are a sovereign people. We are a sovereign nation. We have the right, the unalienable right to, just as every U.S. citizen has the unalienable rights. It is our unalienable right to be a sovereign nation and to exercise those rights to elect our own officials and to be able to make the laws that we need to govern ourselves. We don't need the help of the assistance or the assistance of the U.S. government. We are smart enough, we are powerful enough to do it ourselves. And that's what we choose to do because that's our right to do as a sovereign nation.
And I think there is that awareness now too with those land acknowledgements. That's really helped the tribes a lot, because people are realizing it's like, oh, this was their land that we're on, so that's a part of that awareness of, them using that to say that at the beginning of any presentation, or even it's on now a lot of their websites.
Hisquo He Shaba for joining us for the Indigenous Voices Podcast. Indigenous Voices is available wherever you get your podcasts. Follow and subscribe at fortnisqually.org. This podcast is produced in partnership with the Fort Nisqually Foundation and is generously supported by Humanities Washington's Washington Stories Fund Grant and the Pierce County Historic Preservation Grant, as well as representatives from the Puyallup, Nisqually, Muckleshoot, and Cowlitz tribes. The podcast is also a partner of Washington State America's 250th. Music by Vincent Johnson from Nooksack, Lummi, and Nashani Johnson, Jamestown, Sklallam, and Lummi.